Well, hey everybody, I'm Sam. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for 22 years now. I'm a biblical studies student. I'm a Bible teacher. I have degrees in Bible and theology. I write on my website, sandberg.org, if you want to check that out. My training involves biblical studies, theology, biblical languages, things like that. We are back with another Theology Thursday video, and we are jumping back into Bibliology, the study of the Bible. Where we've been, if you haven't been with us, you can go back and watch all of those videos. I have them all on a playlist. But we've covered theology proper, the study of God. Now we're into bibliology, the study of the Bible. And we've talked about the fact that God has revealed himself. And then last week we talked about inspiration of the text, the 5 different views of inspiration. What does that mean? What does it mean for authority? This week we're going to talk about something I find very interesting. Some people may think this is not that interesting, but this is a discipline and a methodology that we have to understand and have to know if we are going to interact with the text and understand the transmission of the text over the years, understand some of the stuff I was talking about last week about when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we can now look back and understand that we're about 90 to 95% accurate with the Masoretic text, with the Greek New Testament, all that kind of stuff. And so we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about something called source criticism or textual criticism. And we are going to take a look at the source criticism and textual criticism in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so for Christians, that's the Old Testament, Genesis through Malachi. And we're not going to look at the Apocrypha. We're not going to look at the pseudepigrapha. We're just going to look at the books, the ones that we find in the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the Tanakh, I guess we would call it, because the Torah is a part of that. And we're going to take a look at what scholars use to determine, how do we figure out where the errors were, what was going on there, and then how do we prefer one manuscript over another, all that kind of stuff, okay? So source criticism, we're going to explore what's called higher criticism and lower criticism of the Hebrew Bible. So we're going to jump right into it. The slides will be right here. I'll be up in the corner again. And here we go, okay? Source criticism is this section. Lower criticism of the Hebrew Bible is what we're going to focus on today. And so there is higher criticism and there is lower criticism. Higher criticism deals with questions of textual authorship and the integrity of the text itself, the documents themselves. We're not going to talk about that today. We're not going to get into higher criticism. We're just going to deal with what's called lower criticism today. And lower criticism or textual criticism is concerned with the task of trying to restore the original text, dealing with the copies which have been preserved for us. So there were at one point in time, there were autographs. There were original, pen to papyrus, skins, whatever it was. And then those got copied down and got passed along and got copied and got copied. We no longer have the autographs like I talked about last week. And so now all we have is these manuscripts. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to take the copies of these manuscripts, and textual criticism takes all of them and tries to deal with this idea and this concern of how do we restore what was originally there based upon all these different readings, all these different variant texts that we have. How can we see what was actually there and how can we reconstruct that? That's what lower criticism is really all about. And so the statement I made last week, that because of Dead Sea Scrolls, because of other findings with the New Testament, we can probably say we have anywhere between 90 to 95% accuracy of the original, or close to, or maybe accuracy of what, is older versus what we have today. So then here comes the question. If the text is 90 to 95% accurate to those earlier texts that we have, then maybe closest to the original, what are the 5 to 10% that aren't? Okay, what are that 5 to 10%? Where are the errors? What are they? Are they that big of a deal? That kind of a thing. Okay, so this is where source criticism and textual criticism comes into play. Okay, and so we're going to talk about types of manuscript errors. Okay, because these are important just to know. And That way you don't make mistakes of saying things like, well, the Masoretic text is 100% accurate to the Dead Sea Scrolls and that kind of stuff, when you can say, oh, well, we know it's about 90 to 95%. And the reason we know is because of all of these kind of variants and errors and different differences in the text, okay? So here are some types of manuscript errors that we can identify as we look at different variants of these texts, okay? First, there's what's called haplography. In haplography, all it is the writing of a letter, symbol, or a word only once when it should have been written more than once. And haplography has probably crept into the Masoretic text in quite a few places. We can actually see, if you look at the Great Isaiah Scroll, and then you look at the Masoretic text, you can see differences and variants in those that are haplography for sure. A symbol, letter, a word is different. It should have been this way and it's this way. Or maybe it should have been written more than once and it wasn't. Maybe there should be something there that isn't there. Or maybe there is something there that shouldn't be there. Haplography is that kind of stuff, okay? We can see this really notably in the Masoretic text in Judges 20, verse 13. Okay, so in Judges 20, verse 13, there's a statement there. It says, in the Masoretic text, it just says Benjamin, which is Benjamin. But the way you say sons or children of Benjamin in Hebrew is B'nai Benjamin. But what we have in the Masoretic text is just Benjamin. There is no B'nai in there. It only includes that. And so how do we know it should be B'nai Benjamin? Well, the correct reading is actually preserved for us in the Septuagint, in the LXX. And it says children of Benjamin. Also, there's a plural verb in the Masoretic text that actually demands that we have a plural noun, but all it has in the Masoretic text is Benjamin. So if you were to look at any Bible software that has the Hebrew in it, what you would see is B'nai, which is sons of or children of. It's in brackets because it's not actually in that text, but they put it there because this should be there. Because we see this, it's a singular noun, Benjamin, but a plural verb, so these have to match. And so they go, oh, well, the children of Benjamin, that's how they match. These two things match. So haplography, it's where something is there that shouldn't be there, syllable, letter, word, or maybe it's something that, should be there that isn't there. That's what's called haplography, okay? The next error is what's called didography. And this is when it's the writing twice of that which should have been written only once in the text. And so scribes are writing down, of course, and they're, as they're writing, sometimes maybe they'll write something and they'll write it again on accident because they lost their place. I wanted to handwrite the Greek New Testament. Started in Matthew and I started going, and I got to tell you, I got halfway through the genealogy and I looked down and I had written the same line twice. It's because I was not paying attention. So it's very easy as you're writing this stuff down to make a mistake. It's very easy to, even if you're trying to be as meticulous as possible, it's really easy to copy words twice, do this kind of stuff. And so you can see how this happens in these manuscripts, okay? Isaiah 30:30 in some manuscripts has this here, it's Weismar, it's Weismia and Weismar, which means cause to be heard, cause to be heard. But the Masoretic text actually corrects it and just has Weismia, which is only listed once, means cause to be heard. And so we don't need to have cause to be heard, cause to be heard. And so that's a didography. It's written twice instead of once. Okay. The next one is what's called metathesis, which is the reversing of the proper position of letters or of words. And so in Isaiah 32:19, some of the manuscripts have hayar, the forest, instead of the reverse of Hayir, which is the city, which actually the city fits the context better in that. It says, I think the verse says that hail will come down, and it says into the forest and then the city, or crushing the city or something like that. And it's like, it doesn't make sense in the context the way the Masoretic text reads. And so you're like, is this an error? Is this a problem? Should it say the hail will come down to the city and crush the city, kind of a deal, versus the hail will come down the forest and destroy the city? Like, it just, the context doesn't work with those two words in the Masoretic text. And so we think, critics think that, this is a metathesis. This is where we accidentally switched some of the lettering around, and we put the yod in the wrong place there versus it should be in the right place. So anyways, that's metathesis. There's also what's called fusion, which is the combining of two separate words into one word on accident. The Masoretes amend, actually, there's two different instances of this, even in Isaiah chapter 3, that we see that's like, oh, wow. The Masoretes, they amended the text of Isaiah 3:19 in a footnote. Although the change is obviously correct according to the context, the Masoretes wouldn't change the text. They just put it and amended it in the footnote. And when you look at the Masoretic text in chapter 3, verse 19, you see like that word doesn't make any sense there. And I don't remember the word offhand, that's why I didn't put it in here. But I remember looking at it and going, that word does not make any sense. Then you see it split apart. You're like, oh, that's why it should have been two words, not one. And here's another one, Isaiah 3:15. One of the variants of the Masoretic text reads this: "They're king by crushing my people." But it was wrong. It's completely wrong. And so the Masoretes changed it to fit the context, and it reads, "What do you mean by crushing my people?" And the difference there you can see is that the word there, malakim, is right there, and I think that's how you say that. I don't have the vowel pointing, so it's really tough there. And then it's actually split up into two words. One word means they're king, and one word means what do you mean? And the two words together means what do you mean? And so you can see how like the Masoretic text actually splits those two words apart. Instead of having it, as one word as like their king, it's actually what do you mean? Okay. All right, next one, fission. Now, I don't have examples for all of these, but they are variants in the text. I just couldn't think of them off the top of my head. There's fission, which is the dividing up of a single word into two words, which we just looked at fusion. That was the taking the two words and mashing them up into one. Now we also have the opposite effect happening sometimes in the text. Then there is homophonies, which is the substitution of one homonym for another homonym. A word that sounds like this is going to sound like this one, and so on and so forth. There's also the misreading of certain letters that happens. And so the translation happens in a kind of a really weird way. I'll show you one of those. From 600, and here's what happened. From 600 BCE onward, the Hebrew letters Daleth and Resh resembled each other pretty closely. As you can see there's the Daleth and there's the Resh, and they look almost identical except for one little mark there. One has a rounded end, one has a little mark there. Like a line and then line and then the rounded is the Resh. And so it actually, you can get it kind of mixed up. And so it actually occurs in proper names a lot. So Dodanim of Genesis 10:4 appears as Rodamin in 1 Chronicles 1:7. And then it's probably in, that referring to the Herodians. And so the question we have to ask is which one's right? Which one's wrong? Maybe 1 Chronicles 1 is actually right and Genesis is not. And so that's the question that we have to ask is, which letter got mixed up here? Also, the Hebrew letters Vav and Yod, they were also written very similarly from 150 BC onward, and so sometimes those were to get confused. And what would end up happening is not only would the letters, that would happen in proper names because you would just kind of transliterate the name, but sometimes it would change complete words. You'd have a completely different word, completely different sentence because of that. So sometimes that would happen. There's also another one. This is a homotuliton, and this is the omission of an intervening passage because the copy size skips from one ending to a similar ending. This is what I was talking about when I was copying the Greek text. And I'm like, why did I write the same line again? Or why did I skip out like 3 lines? It's because I looked at a word and then I found the same word, but it was 3 lines lower, and I started going because my eyes were tired. It's difficult to do this stuff. Okay. In 1 Samuel 14:21, the Septuagint, the LXX, has 2 occurrences of "O Lord God of Israel" with 19 words between them. Okay. In the Masoretic text, however, there is no 19 words, and it only has one of those "O Lord God of Israel." So then the question we have to ask is, okay, which one's right? Is the Masoretic text right? Is the Septuagint right? And it must be determined if the Masoretic text dropped those 19 words by this type of error, this holotuleton, because maybe a scribe skipped it on accident, or maybe the LXX, the Septuagint scribes, inserted these 19 words in from an unknown source that we don't have anymore. And so these are the questions we have to ask and try to wrestle with. What is more likely? Is the Masoretic text having an error here? Is it missing these words? Or is the Septuagint adding these words that maybe shouldn't have been there in the first place? And so we see this kind of error happening. And this is some of the stuff that happens in the Great Isaiah Scroll. There's like whole verses missing in some places. And so we have to try to account for that. Like, why is it that we have this in the Masoretic text, but we don't have it here? Or why do we have this here in the Great Isaiah Scroll, but we don't have it in the Masoretic text? Or why do we have these letters and spelling changes and all these other kind of stuff, and haplography and all this? So these are the things that, textual critics and scholars who do this kind of stuff for a living, these are the questions they have to wrestle with. This is how they look at the text, all that kind of stuff, okay? There's also the accidental omission of words. And 1 Samuel 13:1 is a really great example of this. In the King James Version, which touted that they would say that we use the Masoretic text and that only, in 1 Samuel 13:1 in the King James Version, there is no number supplied in that verse. In the New American Standard, which uses the reconstructed critical text, they supply the number 40 because they know there's a number that should be there, and that seems like it might be the best number to put there. But what we know is that the Septuagint, other manuscripts, they don't have any kind of numeral here. There is a correct number that should go there, but whatever it was omitted and it was lost before the 3rd century BCE. Why do we know that? Because the LXX doesn't have it. The Septuagint doesn't have the number in it. And so there was a number that should have been there, but it was lost. It's gone. It's not there anymore. And so the critical text, as we reconstructed this and we were looking at it, we said, oh, there needs to be a number there. What number seems like it could be the best number to put there? And they came up with the number 40 because that seems like contextually that would be the number that would work there. But there is no number there in any of our manuscripts that we have. And so they had to try to figure out, okay, why did this happen? Was this an accidental omission of this? Where'd it go? There needs to be a number there. There's no number there. What do we do with that? Okay. So sometimes that happens. So how do scholars and how do these textual critics, how do they make the decisions that they do? What are the filters? What is the methodology by which we use textual criticism to determine which variants we should go with and how we should read this? Well, there are actually what we call the canons of textual criticism, okay? So introduction to this. The textual critics have established certain criteria for arriving at an intelligent choice among 2 or more variant texts, okay? This method must be applied with great discrimination, considering all the circumstances that are involved and making choices on these kind of things, okay? But I want to give you kind of the behind-the-scenes look at how textual critics look at variants and determine this was probably more of an original reading than another one. Okay, the canon number 1 is this, that the older reading is to be preferred. The older reading is to be preferred. What the manuscript that is older is usually the one that we would prefer. It's usually the one we think is more like the original than the newer one. But what we need to understand is that the older manuscript is not necessarily the most carefully copied manuscript. And so we have to look at how it's been copied, what it says. Is it close to what we have? Is the reading more preferred than the other one? Why is there a variant here? And so this rule applies when the older manuscript is at least as reliable as the other ones are. There's not something weird in it. There wasn't something bad, so they scrapped it and we used it. there needs to be reliability to it. But if all things are equal and considered equal, the older reading is to be preferred over the newer one. All right, canon number 2 is that the difficult reading is to be preferred. So the question is why? Well, it's because a scribe or a copyist was more apt to simplify the wording of a text for their readers rather than make it more difficult to understand. So if you saw two texts, they're supposed to be the same, but one was a more difficult kind of a reading, and then one looked like it was easier to understand. More often than not, a scribe would look at that and say, "That's clunky. That's worded weird. Let me fix that over here." But what that would tell us is that the more difficult reading is actually probably the more original reading. This rule doesn't apply if the difficult reading does not make sense at all. That's important to know, or contradicts the same author's meaning elsewhere in the passage or larger context. Now, if that reading, or if it doesn't make sense, or it contradicts something, if it contradicts something in another book or something else, we wouldn't call that a variant. We wouldn't even say that that was a scribal error or a correction. That's just something, outside of the text. If it's within the larger context of the book or in that specific passage, if it doesn't contradict anything, then this wouldn't apply. Okay, or if it contradicts something within that smaller context, then this rule would not apply. Canon number 3, the shorter reading is to be preferred because scribes were more apt to insert new materials than to omit any of the sacred text. They wouldn't take stuff out. More likely, they would add stuff in to try to help it make sense if it didn't make any sense. And so this, in cases of haplography and homotuliton, this does not apply. Canon number 4, the reading which best explains all of the variants are to be preferred. Canon number 5, the reading with the widest geographic support is to be preferred. Canon number 6, the reading which most conforms to the style and diction of the author is to be preferred. So if you have a variant and you've been reading this same author and it seems like one variant, it feels more stylistically like the author would be writing than the other one, then it's usually that one is what they will go with. And then canon number 7, there's a lot here. Okay, canon number 7 is the reading which reflects no doctrinal bias is actually to be preferred. And so we see that here. So the Septuagint and the Targums reveal that later Jewish thought shied away from human-like representations of God. And so what they would say is, well, that seems like doctrinal bias. That seems like they didn't like that, so they stopped doing that. But a variant which tends to minimize this factor is known as anthropomorphism, which is a lot in the Hebrew Bible. And so where the Septuagint would kind of walk away from anthropomorphism and some of the Targums would walk away from that, the Masoretic text would be like, no, we go back to that. And then the older readings would even show that is that's showing the doctrinal bias is later and the other reading is better, it's older. So what are the Targums? That's a great lead into this next point. Okay, the Targums were explanations of the Hebrew text in Western Aramaic. Okay, they were written from Jews who ceased to understand Hebrew. They didn't understand Hebrew anymore. They understood Aramaic, and so they wrote out the Hebrew text in Aramaic, or the explanations of them, of what they meant. And so we're not sure when the Targums were committed to writing, but they were not included. What we can know is this. They were not included in the margin of the text until after the Masoretic text was completed in 900 CE. All right. So in summary of all that we've covered, especially of textual criticism and source criticism, where the Masoretic text and other witnesses offer the same text and it is sensible, it should not be rejected just for conjecture because we didn't like the Masoretic text, okay? So the Masoretic text, when those other witnesses, the variants, they're not really variants, they're kind of just the same thing, Septuagint, whatever, we can go with the Masoretic text. Where the Masoretic text and other witnesses deviate and both are sensible, the preference is usually given to the Masoretic text unless there's a good reason to not give it preference. And so I want to say 8 times out of 10, the Masoretic text is going to be the one that's preferred there, unless there's a really good reason to not go with it. Where the Masoretic text is doubtful because of language and context, and the other witnesses offer a satisfactory reading, the latter should be given preference over the Masoretic text. And then the humanity of the scribe always needs to be taken into account for any variance, okay? We have to realize that these were human beings writing this down. They can make mistakes. Their fingerprints are all over these texts. And so we need to take into account for that and just say, you know what? These scribes that were copying stuff down are human, and they're going to make mistakes, and they're going to add stuff in. They're going to take stuff out. They're going to forget stuff. They're going to skip things. They're going to do that kind of stuff as they are trying to keep this text rolling throughout the years, okay? So that is source criticism of the Hebrew Bible. There's probably a lot more that goes into that, but that's just kind of a general walkthrough of all of that. I love this stuff. This stuff is so fascinating to me because when you look at some of these ancient manuscripts and that kind of stuff, and you see this kind of thing, you're like, oh, that's what that is, and that's what that is. And that's just, for me, that's kind of an exciting thing. All right. Well, this has been Theology Thursday, and we've been doing bibliology and source criticism. Next time, we're going to dive into one of the last lessons on bibliology before we get into Christology. All right. So subscribe, write some comments, and I'll see you in the next one.